Hey everyone. Today we are going to continue our discussion of eschatology and talking about the next two classes. We're going to be talking about kind of the final locations for everyone. And today we're going to start with death and hell and the location of the final location for the unsaved people of the earth. So um, let's start out by talking a little bit about what death is. And it's interesting, as I say this first statement, I obviously have a couple caveats there. Death is the destiny of all human beings, something that we all just kind of have to come to grips with. Obviously, with the COVID-19, and this is maybe making it a little bit easier for people to come to grips with death, knowing that the people around us are dying, and it's something that is here with us. And but as I say that, death is the destiny of all human beings. I just give a couple little notes. Genesis 5:24 shares one man, Enoch, who apparently never physically died. Instead, it says in 5:24, he was no more because God took him away. I think I mentioned this as being like a little bit like a rapture when we talked about the rapture topic, but just Enoch was taken away in Genesis 5:24. If you want to do a little deeper study on that, there's some discussion about when he was taken away, if he was taken away just before the flood, and if you do some of the genealogy and the counts, it's kind of interesting there. Another famous example is, or the only other example, is in 2 Kings 2:11. And this is talking about Elijah. And it says, as they were walking, that's Elijah and Elisha, were walking along and talking together. Suddenly a chariot of fire and horses of fire appeared and separated the two of them. And Elijah went up to heaven in a whirlwind. So Enoch and Elijah are the only two who did not die. Um, and of course, Elijah is famous because of him showing up at the Mount of Transfiguration with Jesus. And then some people think he will be there as one of the two witnesses as well. And then, of course, 1 Corinthians 15:51, as I was saying in our discussion of the rapture, many of us believe that there will be a group of people who do not die. Instead, they will be raptured, and believe that that's what this verse is saying. Listen, I tell you a mystery. We will not all sleep. Again, sleep there being a kind of an idiom or figurative language for die, but we will all be changed. And so those who are raptured will not physically die. So as we talk about the different um, types of death, doesn't kind of sounds weird to talk about different types of death, but we typically think of three different types of death, and death means separation. The first one in is called physical death, and that's the one we're most aware of when people die. When we use the word death, that's typically what we mean. When we say someone has died, we typically mean they have physically died. And so it just means your physical body ceases, it stops working, and we do believe that there is a spiritual part of you as well. And so at that point, your physical and your spiritual part, and here's the word, are separated. Whatever happens to your physical body does not matter at that point. It could be cremated, it could be buried, it could be destroyed in your death. It doesn't matter because your spirit, your spiritual part, your immaterial part is separated from that physical part. And there's a couple verses. James 2:26 says the body without the spirit is dead. And then Ecclesiastes 12:7, and the dust returns to the ground it came from, and the spirit returns to God who gave it. And I think there's some interesting application to this, and I don't want to get too much into it, but just to make you think a little bit, asking these questions. Today in science, they try to clone people, and I know that the science world would love to be able to create their own physical bodies. And I think no matter what happens, what we see here, because as Christians, we believe to be a human being, there is more than just a physical body, a shell, there is a spirit as well. And so, whatever science is able to do, the part of the spirit and the soul is essential to make what we call a human being as well. So physical death is when you die. Second type of death is called spiritual death. And again, this isn't one that we typically use We don't walk around and say, "Oh, you're spiritually dead" or anything like that. But it is a concept that we understand. And so if it means separation, spiritual death simply means that our spirit is separated from God. It is the type of death that Adam and Eve encountered immediately after sinning in the Garden of Eden. So when Satan said, or God said, "You will surely die," and Satan said, "You surely won't die," there's a lot of trickery going on there. They didn't immediately physically die, but they did immediately spiritually die. And you see the separation very obvious in the story of Adam and Eve, and that they hid from God in the garden. They covered themselves with clothing, with plant clothing, and you see that separation immediately there in the Garden of Eden. A couple other verses here just talking about, oh, and of course that translates to us that we are born in this state of spiritual death. And of course, Psalm 51:5 says, "Surely I was sinful at birth, since the time my mother conceived me." And then Ephesians 2:1, not talking about birth, but talking about people who are now saved. It says, "As for you, you were dead in your transgressions and sins." And so our prior to salvation state is spiritual death. So if you want to think about and use this terminology, you would say when you are born physically alive, but you are born spiritually dead. And then, of course, the most important is the third one, which we would call eternal death. And this is basically the state of spiritual death for eternity. And so if you die physically, and you are still spiritually dead, then you are now eternally spiritually dead. You are separated from God for eternity. 2 Thessalonians 1:9 says they will be punished with everlasting destruction. And shut out from the presence of the Lord. And just remember this verse and this phraseology for our later on when we talk about um, eternal hell and things like that. But this is one of those key verses that we'll look at later on as well, or think about at least later on. And then, of course, Revelation 21:8b, we looked at this before, but it says they will be consigned to the fiery lake of burning sulfur. This is the second death. And so eternal death is what we would say is hell. We would use those kind of terms. It is where the person who dies without Christ will go, and it is the state of their existence for eternity. And I use those words. I tried to use those words really specifically. They still exist, and they will exist eternally, but they will also exist in an eternal separation from God. And the Bible draws, gives us a picture of what this looks like with very vivid words, and that's what we're going to look at next. What is that place or that position like? So a couple things before we get into that about death. Number one, these are just some obvious, I think obvious things, but just some things that to talk about. Death is caused by sin. It wasn't created by God. That's important there. We see this in the Garden of Eden. Death occurs when they disobey God's commandment. We see it in Romans 5:12 that it says that as death entered, um, or sorry, as sin entered the world, so does death. It causes death. And so that's important to see that. Number two, this is kind of maybe a variant view of death, but just to clarify, death is real. It's not an illusion. There are some cults or either other religions that believe that the world we live in now is maybe an illusion or fake. It's almost like if you've seen some of those movies like Matrix or things like that, where we're in like a dream world or something like that. And so our spiritual body is the only thing, or our spirit is the only thing that matters, and sickness and death are purely imagination or created through some other kind of means. And so it's interesting that that Hollywood has made movies that are kind of like that. But we would say that's not true. We would say obviously we live in a physical world, and there is really physical sickness, and there is really physical death. And you can see some different forms of that as I wrote here. Number three, death is not, and I mentioned this already, not part of God's original creation. I think this is most vividly seen through the other named tree in the Garden of Eden called the tree of life. And it just gives the appearance that they will never die. If they eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, they will surely die. But if they don't, the opposite of that is they will not die. And the tree of life kind of represents that. And of course, even more representation of that is when they do sin, they are taken out of the garden where they will not have the tree of life available to them anymore. And of course, we'll look at this more next week, but of course the opposite then of that is what we would say is true, is that in eternity there will no longer be death. So you can see that in the last sentence there. Revelation 21:4 describes that as there will be no longer death. So that's the final victory of God is over death itself. Also, this last phrase is just kind of something to think about. Death is for us, for the believer, is sadness, is separation. I mentioned earlier, I didn't say, but think of, even Jesus cried, wept, the famous verse, Jesus wept at the death of Lazarus, which is so strange to think of Jesus knowing where Lazarus is going, yet he weeps when Lazarus dies. And so there's a lot of different explanations for that, but maybe the most simplest is because Jesus is sad that he doesn't have Lazarus right there, and that Lazarus goes through the pain and the suffering. And others have said that it's because Jesus, they don't understand who Jesus is, and different things like that. But it for us today, the most important thing I'm trying to say is that when someone passes away that is a Christian, and you are a Christian, there is certainly separation and sadness and loss, but it is temporary. The idea that you will see them again is almost always mentioned in part of funeral services, memorial services at Christian events. There is hope for the future. Of course, then the opposite of that is true as well. True sorrow, true loss is for those who have passed away and have no hope. And I've shared a story before of when I was on my internship as a college student, and was part of a funeral for a person who passed away who was unsaved. Just a community opportunity that the pastor that I was working with had, and to see the real sorrow and mourning of people who had no hope that they would ever see their husband, their father, their son ever again. Um, and then for me to sit there, because it was an open casket funeral, which was rather strange for me, to sit there and to look at this shell of a body that again was empty, right? The spirit's gone, but it's just a shell, and to think that his life is over. He now is in eternity apart from God, and it's just a really sad thing. And I hope this is at the end. Really the one application question I want us to think about is, what does this understanding of death and hell do for us as Christians? And I really think this is maybe the big point, is the motivation for us as Christians to say this is real, death is real, separation from God for eternity is real. What are we doing about it? And so think about that as we talk about our next topic, which is hell. When I was a kid, I would always say HE double hockey sticks because I never wanted to say hell. Now, as a pastor and a teacher, I can say it because I'm preaching it from the Bible. So, hell is just basically described as the final and eternal destination for all those who have died apart from Jesus Christ. So if you die on this physical earth and have not accepted Jesus Christ as your Savior, then the most simplest thing that we say, and we'll say, you either go to heaven or you go to hell. And as you read the Bible, you'll see that there's obviously different terms and different things and different places that it's called, but in the simplest terms, we would say that you go to hell. And simply defined, as I've already said a couple times, it is simply separation from God, as we saw in a verse earlier in Second Thessalonians. But the Bible is very vivid when it describes people who go to this place, and it is almost always um, comes with suffering and judgment and pain. I mean, the term the worst terms of suffering and death are used, such as burning, fire, right? Like if you think of the most painful things that you can go through, often like a burn is one of the most painful and suffering things to like be burned. And I wouldn't even don't even want to imagine what it might be like to be burned alive, but that seems to be the pictures that are drawn with the idea of hell. So whether hell is an actual like fire is not, again, this is kind of goes with our interpretation of prophecy, is not as important as understanding what it means. And fire might represent suffering, eternal suffering, and not just eternal suffering, but the worst kind of eternal suffering that you can imagine. And so it's very tough to comprehend. And we'll look at some variant views of hell in a few seconds here. And most of the time, these variant views of hell are because people can't wrap their arms around the idea that people would go to hell. So the typical words in the Bible for hell in the Greek are Hades, which is interesting because Hades is the Greek word or god of death and the underworld. If you're familiar with the Disney cartoon Hercules, the bad guy there is Hades. Though it's interesting in Greek mythology that Hades is not necessarily a bad guy. That's maybe more of a 20th and 21st century kind of Hollywood picture of Hades. Instead, that's his region, that's his reign, right? Like Poseidon is over the water, Hades is over the underworld. He's not necessarily good or bad. Obviously, you don't want to meet him because you don't want to go there, but he's not necessarily bad. That's just his job, right? At least in Greek mythology. And so it's interesting that that's the way it's described in modern day Hollywood, but in mythology, that's not what it was. It was more of a stated fact of place. In the Old Testament, the word is Sheol, and the Sheol word can really be used. We have to be careful because it can be used for anybody who goes to it. It can be used for the grave. It can be used for the actual place where you would bury somebody. It can be used for going down in the depths, but it can also be used for what we would call hell today. And so we have to be careful. There's really not a term for heaven in like we think of in the Old Testament. We'll look at that next week. But pretty much everybody went to Sheol, not just the bad. And so it's more of a word for just the bad place. And of course, um, when you look at the Luke 16 parable or story of Lazarus and the rich man, it does seem like everybody does go to Sheol. And so that's an interesting. I think we're going to look at that passage more next week because we're going to talk about Abraham's bosom. So a couple key verses here. These are the word Sheol, just so you can see it. Genesis 37:35, when Jacob finds out that his son Joseph, he thinks his son Joseph is dead, it says, all his sons and daughters came to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. No, he said, I will continue to mourn until I join my son and the word there in Hebrew is Sheol. So again, Jacob says that his son is in Sheol. So if we just want to say that Sheol means hell, then we're saying that Joseph is also in hell. And so we have to kind of understand that there's a different meaning in the Old Testament for this. And then, of course, Psalm 139:8 is a famous passage where David is talking about all the places that he might go where God will still be there. And this is often used for the omnipresence of God. And it says, if I go up to the heavens, you are there. Again, I don't think that word means heaven the way we often think it means. And then he says, if I make my bed in Sheol, the depths, you are there. And so again, we have to understand that this word means a little bit more than just hell like we think of, at least in the Old Testament. In the New Testament, especially the Gospels, Jesus uses the word Gehenna to describe hell. And it's a very interesting place. It is called the Valley of Hinnom. And in the Old Testament, you can see down in 2 Kings 23:10, it says, he desecrated Topheth, which was in the valley of Ben Hinnom, that's Gehenna, so no one could use it to sacrifice their son or daughter in the fire of to Molech. And so this is some kind of valley, some kind of place just outside the city of Jerusalem where people would actually sacrifice by fire their children. And so there's a very vivid picture, of course, of suffering, being burned alive, and that's the picture in the Old Testament of what they would do to appease Molech, one of the gods of Canaan. In Jesus' day, it was probably the city dump, the place where you took your garbage and certainly wouldn't have the kind of garbage we have today, but also a place where you would burn the bodies of those who were either criminals or just they didn't have the money to pay for a funeral or a place to be buried, and so their bodies would just be burned. And this place seems to have been maybe any, I'm not going to say eternal, but a place where the fire never goes out. It's always burning. And so there's the picture of what Gehenna or hell means. And so Jesus is using this place that the people in Jerusalem know to describe hell. And so Matthew 5:22b says, if anyone who says, you fool, they will be in danger of the fire of Gehenna. That's the word Gehenna there. And then in Matthew 10:28 it says, very, very powerful verse. Don't be afraid of those who can kill the body, right? Physical death, but cannot kill the soul, spiritual death, right? Like you think of today, if you were in like a terrorist situation or something like that, like, okay, that guy, he could kill me physically, but he can't spiritually kill me, right? Rather, Matthew 10:28, be afraid of the one who can destroy both soul and body in hell, right? That's the real, and that again is Gehenna there. That's the real powerful thing, right? Like physically we can die, but spiritually, I want to make sure I'm spiritually alive. Like that's the most important thing. Whatever happens here on earth happens, but spiritually I want to be alive. And then another use is this word Tartarus that's only used one time in 2 Peter 2:4. In Greek and Roman mythology, Tartarus was the place where the worst offenders would go, and including those who were actually the enemies of the gods themselves. And so it was thought of, seen as lower than Hades or hell. Even worse, the worst punishment, the worst suffering was there. Jews used it to describe the place where fallen angels had gone. I think there's a usage there of Greek mythology to kind of absorb it into the Jewish kind of theology, and I think that's why Peter probably uses that word to describe this place where the angels are. And if you read it, it says, "For if God did not spare the angels when they sinned, but sent them to 2 Peter 2:4." And again, this is one of those dangerous things. It says hell, but that is not the word Hades and it is not the word Gehenna. It is the word Tartarus right there. Putting them in chains of darkness to be held for judgment. So, whatever Tartarus is, it seems to be worse and also a place for the angels to go. And then we've already talked about the abyss, so I just want to summarize that. The abyss is the place in Luke 8 where the demon legion didn't want to go. In Revelation 9, it's the place where all those demon like locust things came out. And then, of course, in Revelation 20, it's the place where Satan is thrown for 1,000 years. And so the abyss, again, also seems to be this some kind of place where demons or Satan or fallen angels abide. There are a couple different views of the afterlife for those who are unsaved, and I call that variant views of hell, but you could call it variant views of the afterlife too. I was going to talk about purgatory. I didn't really know too much to say on that, and maybe we'll talk about that a little bit more next week because I think it fits more into the heaven category because purgatory is typically is seen as the place where people who are on their way to heaven go first, not on their way to hell. So if you're going to go to hell, you go directly. But in some theologies, if you're going to go to heaven, you have to stop at purgatory on your way. And so we'll come to that next week. The first one is universalism, and universalism simply means, if you think of the word universal, everyone universally gets saved. That's the basic view of universalism, but there are different variants to this. The basic, or one of the views is that those who die apart from Christ go to hell, but it is seen as more of a you get a sentence. So, for example, if you were not such a bad person, you would go to hell for X amount of years, and the worse you are, the longer you would be there. And it's interesting that even one of our church fathers, Origen, believed that even he was universalist, believed that even Satan himself would eventually come out of hell and be reconciled. Colossians 1:20 is one of his verses he would use, that everything must be reconciled to God. And so even Satan eventually, and maybe that would be millions of years or even billions of years because we have eternity, obviously. But eventually, everyone, including Satan, the fallen angels, would be reconciled to God. Other views of universalism, though, are that you just everybody immediately gets saved, and that's the view of the Unitarian Universalist Church. They really have no gospel, they have no salvation. You just are saved just because your existence, and they meet, and it's more of a social club, and they try to do good deeds, but it really doesn't matter because everyone goes to heaven. There is no hell in that case. And then, of course, a little more recently from Love Wins, Rob Bell's book, he seemed to state the case that people went to hell, but when they were in hell, they were given another opportunity to accept Christ while they were in hell, and if they accepted or responded positively, they would be released from hell. And of course, I think the picture of hell, everyone would accept that or respond positively to that. So those are universalist views. Annihilationism is another view, which again is kind of a way to soften the punch of hell. So when people maybe argue, how could a loving God send people to suffer for eternity in hell? Annihilationism says, well, they don't. Instead, they are annihilated, which basically means they cease to exist. And so in annihilationism, those who die apart from Christ will just cease to exist. They will exist no more. Um, this obviously doesn't look at some of those key passages that we looked at very literally. They mean when it says, destruction, they say it means destroyed, annihilated, even though that doesn't seem to be the picture of any of these end times passages. For example, Revelation, those kind of things. It doesn't seem to have that. Same with Gehenna. The picture of Gehenna is like an eternal burning, not a destruction or anything like that. And so the other thing I have a hard time with is I don't quite understand how this makes, if you're trying to, soften the blow of hell, I'm not sure how this actually makes it any softer. You don't suffer for eternity, you cease to exist. Okay. Other views that are interesting are found out in literature. I just wanted to bring a couple of these up. I think it's interesting. Dante's Inferno is a famous story, and he draws the picture of hell as having levels. Again, trying to deal with the fact that maybe, a person who is just a normal person, didn't accept Christ as their savior, goes to hell, and the worst people of all time go to hell, like a Hitler, and just the cruelest murderers and things go to hell, and you can't quite grasp that. Like, why would this person and this person be in the same place? And so Dante draws this picture of levels of hell, and of course, in his first level of hell, he has it's more of like a purgatory type place. It's gray, it's neutral. It's the place where people who go that haven't accepted Christ but aren't terrible people at the same time. And then the levels of hell get worse and worse and worse. And of course, the final level of hell is where Dante says Judas is, because of course he is the worst of sinners. And C.S. Lewis has a similar, if you ever read The Great Divorce, seems like the farther you get away from heaven, the worse it gets. And it's a very, hell is painted as a very gray and mundane type place. And I think C.S. Lewis is more telling a story, a parable. I'm sure Dante was doing that as well. These certainly aren't inspired by any means, but they're their interpretation of it, trying to understand something that's a very difficult topic for us to understand. So I did want you just to think about that final question was, what does learning about death and hell do for us as Christians? How should we respond to this type of thing? Next week we will be looking at eternity and heaven, so a lot more happy topic for us, and I'm just excited to be able to finish this up. Hope you've enjoyed. If you have any questions, please let me know. Thanks.